Hi, this is Janie Helms, and I will be covering a case study with breath hold divers. And it was a study where its focus was to evaluate the kinds of physical effects on the body that can occur even with world-class champion breath hold divers. And they were doing it in the open sea, and they were just trying to see the effects of how depth and pressure and lung volume can affect these people. So the method that they chose to study this and see how things were affected was that they chose two participants. Both were male, non-smokers, and they had no history or knowledge of any cardiovascular or any kind of lung or respiratory diseases. And they also both they were 32 years of age with at least 15 years of experience. So they were very experienced world champion breath hold divers. And what they chose to measure, and they measured these before, during, and after the experiment. So one, they were going to look at the residual volume. It was calculated and then added to the slow vital capacity tests, also known as SVC. And those two things were used and added together to estimate the TLC, which is the total lung capacity. Now, before these two divers descended down in the water, they both performed lung packing, which means that they were able to increase their lung volumes. They took really big, deep breaths. They are very efficient at holding their breath for long periods of time. The RV reserve is describing how the volume difference between the RV and the estimated total lung capacity at a certain depth or at the maximum depth that they were going. And those were calculated according to Boyle's law. And Boyle's law deals with how pressure and volume are related if temperature is not a factor. So how an increase in pressure makes volume or is in a smaller volume, and vice versa. With a larger volume, there is less pressure. When they were going through these dives, they specifically they used these tests, but they specifically looked at certain things. So they wanted to know about the gas exchange and how efficient it was. They used a pulse oximetry and to look at how those adjusted or changed throughout their dive. They used an ultrasound lung beeline. They used indexes of altered lung compliance, meaning that they wanted to know and look at how their lungs were being affected. And then they also had a waterproof electrocardiograph attached to the diver so that they could monitor their heart rate throughout the dive. So the guidelines, both divers actually went to a different depth as well as used a different method. So diver 1, he dove down to 102 meters, which is equivalent to about 335 feet. And they put a weighted rope into the water to help it sink down. They didn't want it to float. What they wanted is that diver going down to 102 meters, they didn't want him to overexert himself. He only used his hands to pull himself down the rope to that depth. So he did not use extra energy. He did not use his feet or kick at all, only his hands down the rope. And what happened to him as he was going down the rope, you have this graph here where it graphed what happened to his lung volume as he went. So he started at his lung capacity when he started was slightly above 10 liters. And by the time he got down to a depth of 102, his lung volume was down below 1. Specifically, it was 0.94 liters. And using all those tests and what they were monitoring with the gas exchange and the beeline and everything else, the results while he did this, besides the reduced lung volume, was one, his gas exchange was impaired. It was not functioning properly in his body. It went from the stress of it, he went from a 23 to a 54 millimeters of mercury of pressure to his blood. He felt, he could feel that pressure. He had breathing discomfort with extra added mucus in there. And he was suffering from a mild nitrogen narcosis, which is like a drowsy state. And it can impair your vision, it can impair your thought process. So he felt a lot of discomfort, and his B line went from 8 to a 27. So even diving down to that depth of 335, he saw some obvious mild symptoms. Diver 2, he dove further down. He was going at a faster speed because he was using fins. He did not use the rope. He just dove straight down. And 117 meters is about 384 feet. And so looking at his results, his lung capacity when he started, he was probably almost 9. It was 8 something, but almost 9 liters. And by the time he got down to 117, his lung volume was way below 1. It was even lower than the 102, which is understandable for the further depth, but he got down to a 0.68 liters. He, just like diver 1, had his gas exchange was impaired. His symptoms were more severe. He had tightness in his chest, so bad that he wanted to cough while he was underwater. Significant nitrogen narcosis, and he even had amnesiac symptoms after the dive, immediately after the dive. So with that increased pressure, the further down you go in the water, the pressure is going to increase. So with them holding their breath, adding an increased pressure from the surrounding water definitely takes a toll on a human's body. So, though, if you take that case study and you apply it to Boyle's Law and you apply it to a situation that could come in handy, people who scuba dive, they always say if you're going to be a diver, you shouldn't hold your breath. You are supposed to breathe in when you're diving, and you're supposed to breathe out when you are returning to the surface. Never hold your breath, because that can cause your lungs to rupture. You can suffer from decompression sickness, which is like that nitrogen narcosis if you ascend too quickly. So this table just kind of shows how pressure underwater relates to how that affects the volume in your lungs and at the depth. So these people, this graph only goes to 30 meters, and yet these divers went to 102 and 117. But you can see, compared to the surface, just going down 30 meters, pressure is 4 times as large, which means it cuts the volume in a quarter. So when you breathe out, when you breathe in, you're increasing the volume of your lungs. And you need that to counteract when you're diving with that pressure going into your body. But then the opposite effect when you're ascending. If you breathe out, you lower the volume inside your lungs, which allows your lungs to not be overexpanded as the pressure releases on your body when you come to the surface. So the case study had a very good point as to how that depth affects the volume and how that can have a physiological effect on a person. Even with world-class breath hold divers, we do know that while diving, you really should not hold your breath because of the physiological effects. And here are my references. Thank you for listening.